The city glittered beneath a canopy of electric lights, a place so alive with bustling foot traffic and swirling neon that few ever noticed what lurked in the peripheral darkness. In a neglected district on the outskirts, an old, crumbling building stood like a rotten tooth in the otherwise gleaming skyline. Thick vines snaked across its broken windows. Its rusted drain pipes groaned with the changing temperatures. People rarely passed this decrepit site anymore, and if they did, it was with hurried steps and anxious glances toward the shadows. For good reason. Locked within the depths of the abandoned structure was a laboratory, hidden behind false walls and constructed centuries ago by an eccentric sorcerer named Gavid, whose ambitions to harness the power of shadows had spiraled far beyond mere academic curiosity. The Gavid shadows were more than just the absence of light. They were conduits to another realm, a dimension where emotions, fears, and desires manifested in malleable form. Over years of obsessive study, he had concocted an elaborate ritual to give these shadowy experts of concealment a half-life of their own, forging bonds between mortal hearts and ephemeral darkness. The question that consumed his every waking moment was simple. If a shadow could be separated from its human host, what properties might it gain if nourished by ancient magic? Drawn by the possibility of creating something that could serve him, Gavid plumbed grim arcane texts in search of spells for animating intangible forms. In the small hours of a moonless night, his experiment reached its triumph. Down in the cobweb-strewn basement, Gavid moved carefully around an intricate, glowing circle etched into the stone floor. He chanted syllables in an old tongue, voice quivering with excitement. The oppressive gloom in the corners of the basement began to swirl, coalescing into intangible forms that flickered around the circle. Candle flames danced unnaturally high, twisting in the sudden gust of energy. Sweat beaded on Gavid's brow, but he refused to blink, incanting the final sentence of his forbidden text. With a crackling hiss, the swirling shadows tore themselves from their corners, surging into his magical circle until they formed a roiling, pulsing mass. It was terrifyingly beautiful. Gavid leaned forward, heart pounding in his chest as the new creation writhed and shifted of its own accord. Tendrils of opaque darkness extended from the main mass, black but tinged with a faint shimmer. They moved like serpents, alive, curious, and ready to break free. For a few glorious seconds, Gavid reveled in his success. Then, as if reading his thoughts, the mass trembled and lunged. Thick bundles of shadow slammed against the invisible barrier that contained them. Shards of abnormal, animated darkness chipped away at the protective runes along the edge of the circle. Each blow chipped a bit more of the chalky sigil, eroding the wards he had so painstakingly drawn. Gavid realized too late that his creations were not mere puppets, but living entities with their own ambitions. A final, resounding blow rocked the basement, and the circle's lines shattered. The protective wards flickered, fading in a hiss of arcane sparks. The roiling darkness collapsed, but quickly reassembled beyond the boundary. Gavid scrambled backward, fumbling for a protective amulet concealed beneath his robe. But the shadows were already on the move, moving with ravenous purpose. They poured up the stairs, around corners, oozing through cracks in the walls and under doors, seeking an escape into the city beyond. When Gavid tried to pursue them, perhaps to recapture or destroy them, he found only a single swirl of darkness left behind. Defiant and free from magical constraint, this last shadow shape hissed at him, an inhuman command to stay back before merging into the pitch-black hallway that led to the outside world. Under the cover of night, the newly liberated shadows spread across the city. Their forms were undetectable in alleys, under street lamps, and in the unlit corners behind towering skyscrapers. In the days that followed, bizarre incidents cropped up throughout the metropolis. Bumbling pickpockets and petty thieves suddenly began to commit more audacious, violent crimes. Shy, soft-spoken neighbours developed scathing tongues and malevolent cunning. Even mild-mannered employees at the local cafe started erupting in fits of jealousy and paranoia, hinting that something intangible had begun feeding their darkest impulses. At the heart of each occurrence was a single clue, an oddly shaped, shifting shadow cast by the afflicted individual, dancing and flickering without any logical connection to the available light sources. Elena Gonzalez, a seasoned detective haunted by her own secrets, first noticed the unusual pattern during her nighttime patrols. She stood in a run-down alley, peering at the victim of a mugging who was describing her assailant. The suspect's behavior had changed mid-robbery, morphing from anxious threats to chilling, purposeful cruelty. Ilana observed from the scene's remnants a bizarre dark smear on the ground, as though a person's silhouette had melted and reformed on concrete. The air felt heavier, oppressive. It made her skin prickle. She took a photograph of the smear on her phone. This wasn't the first assault in the past week that bore a strange trace of gloom, and she needed to piece together the core. Unfortunately, her precinct dismissed her suspicions as superstition. Determined, Ilana stayed after hours at her desk, combing through security footage from local cameras. One particular clip sent a jolt through her spine. A figure on a lonely street corner, momentarily silhouetted under a flickering lamp, appeared to have two shadows. One was normal, a direct reflection of light, but the other twitched in ways that didn't mimic the person's movement at all. As the figure walked, the second shadow bent and stretched, as though testing its new environment. Then the figure turned off the street, the lamp blew out, and the second shadow vanished along the walls. Ilana rewound and played the footage repeatedly, convinced that what she'd witnessed was a clue pointing to something more otherworldly than standard street crime. Gavid, meanwhile, was beside himself with fear. He had fled his laboratory after the living shadows escaped, but he could sense them everywhere. His mind buzzed with unspoken communication, as if echoing the stolen incantations that flowed through him. No matter where he turned, the gloom around him seemed to shift in sinister ways, reminding him that his runaway creations would never truly be beyond his awareness. He hoped to confine them once more, but the city was a labyrinth of light and dark. Their infiltration had already begun. And so, as a last, desperate measure, Gavid stumbled into a rusted telephone booth tucked near an abandoned lot, rummaging for spare parchment and a pen to scribble warnings for the city council, the police, anyone who might take heed. Yet, the moment he lifted his pen, the ink froze in mid-air. A malignant presence tickled the back of his neck. His own shadow quivered, elongated, then broke away from the ground, leaving him feeling oddly diminished. Panicked, he bolted, leaving behind only a single sheet of scrawled gibberish. Days melted into nights, and rumors spread that something inexplicable was overtaking the community. Citizens grew irrational, their once bright moods soured by resentment and envy. Street arguments erupted into full-blown brawls. Previously upstanding people began to steal, sabotage, and manipulate each other in ways they'd never done before. The subtle shift in personalities rattled the city to its core. Even local officials, pastors, and teachers didn't remain untouched. Some, however, resisted, as though battling an unseen parasite that fought to lay claim to their minds. In the midst of this creeping mania, Ilana continued her investigation, often alone, following the faint hints of an unnatural phenomenon. She reached out to a university professor named Dr. Rafiq, an expert in parapsychology and arcane studies. Meeting him in a dusty library, Elena showed him clips of the strange second shadows, detailing the escalations of violence. Dr. Rafiq stroked his salt and pepper beard, troubled by what he saw. "You call them living shadows," he murmured, scanning frame by frame. In certain ancient tomes they're referred to as siphons or night-eaters, entities called forth by shadowmancers. They feed on negative emotions. They magnify them in their hosts. The more destructive a person is, the stronger the shadow becomes, until eventually it can adhere to another host if the first is spent or destroyed. He paused, brow knitted. They're not unstoppable, but capturing them would require the same sort of magic that unleashed them. Armed with this lead, Alana discovered musty references to someone rumoured to have experimented with shadow-based sorcery in the early modern era. Every record pointed to a single name, Gavid. Though official references placed him as long dead, suspiciously similar sightings of a robed figure matching Gavid's historical description cropped up throughout the decades. Alana's detective instincts told her he was real, somewhere in the city, possibly behind the madness gripping its citizens. Suspecting he might also be the only one who could help reverse it, she enlisted Dr. Rafiq's assistance. They deduced the possible location of Gavid's lair, a dilapidated structure in a forgotten part of town known for generations as cursed ground. After all, the building matched descriptions from old archives referencing hidden rooms, suspicious architecture, and fleeting lights at night. Ilana prepared carefully before making the journey. She had no illusions about confronting supernatural forces without backup, so she brought Dr. Rafiq and 2 other trusted colleagues from the precinct, officers who believed something sinister was truly at play. Armed with flashlights, rope, radios, and Dr. Rafiq's carefully curated charms of protection, they ventured into the decayed structure. Shadows danced across the broken floorboards and graffiti-strewn walls, as though mocking their very presence. The floors were littered with dead leaves and shattered glass from windows that had not been cleaned in decades. One by one, they descended into the basement by the meager light of their flashlights. The basement felt alive the moment they stepped into it. The group's footsteps echoed uncomfortably against the stone walls as their beams swept over archaic symbols, half-erased diagrams, and tattered books rotting on tables. And there, in a far corner, where the darkness seemed unnaturally thick, crouched Gavid. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, his robes tattered, as though he had tried hiding for days in his own crypt of secrets. Ilana expected hostility, but what she saw was a man weighed down by grief. She raised a hand to show she wasn't there for violence. Gavid stared at the intruders, trembling. "You have to leave," he rasped, voice raw. "They're all around us now, beyond my power to control. I should never have attempted such a twisted creation. I can't stop them alone." His eyes flicked between the strangers. "Why have you come?" Ilana knelt, ignoring the unsettling chill in the air. "We need to understand how to contain these shadows. They're attaching themselves to people, making them do terrible things. We know you're responsible for unleashing them." Her tone hardened. "But you must help us fix this." Gavid let out something between a sob and a sigh. His shadow on the ground flickered, not yet severed, but distinctly unstable. "They're everywhere now. I miscalculated their power. I thought I could create loyal servants for my research, but they turned on me. If you wish to capture them, you'll need the tools used to summon them in the first place. My summoning circle, the incantations. But they must be sealed with a different energy, the mark of a pure heart. There is no other way." Before they could question him further, a distortion in the darkness behind Gavid began to move. One of the living shadows drifted like inky smoke across the walls, drawn to the gathering of hearts and minds it might twist. The group tensed, flashlights trained on the writhing shape. The beam of one officer's light seemed to pass through it, causing it to ripple, but not truly dispelling it. Then, like a ravenous predator, it darted toward the policeman, latching onto his feet. He shouted, stumbling back, but the creature traveled up his legs, merging with his own shadow until they became indistinguishable. A guttural growl emerged from the officer. His eyes glossed over with an unfamiliar hatred. Acting on pure reflex, Ilana lunged, brandishing one of Dr. Rafiq's protective charms. She pressed the small talisman against his chest. It flared with faint light, forcing the invading shadow to recoil in a hiss of black vapors. The officer gasped, momentarily free, as the living shadow scurried along the walls to retreat into a deeper corner. The group breathed heavily, shaken but resolute. Standing in the creaky basement, they dug through the scattered materials to find the remains of Gavid's summoning circle and the corresponding texts. They discovered the ragged tome containing the incantation, its pages brittle with age. From the annotations in Gavid's messy handwriting, they deduced how the original wards were constructed and how they might imprison the shadows again, this time for good. Under Gavid's direction, Ilana and Dr. Rafik spent hours restoring the damaged sigils on the floor. The officers stood guard, scanning every inch of the walls with beams of light. Each symbol was painstakingly replicated in white chalk, while Gavid whispered arcane blessings over the shapes. When it came time for the sealing incantation, Gavid hesitated. The final step, he explained, requires a clean conscience. Someone whose sense of purpose is unwavering. Only then can the magic form a pure barrier. Unease rippled through the group. Who among them was certain of such purity? Dr. Rafik offered to attempt it, but the sorcerer shook his head after a single glance. Anxiety and regret clouded the professor's eyes. The two officers likewise seemed burdened by moral complexities. All eyes fell on Ilana. She swallowed hard, stepping forward. "I'm not a saint," she said quietly, "but I'll do whatever is needed." She thought of the people she'd failed to protect, the messy personal life that nipped at the edges of her conscience. Despite her flaws, she carried a steadfast duty to defend her city. She would see this through. Gavid laid out the final lines of the ritual, scanning her expression carefully to confirm she was truly ready. Reluctantly, but with burning determination, Ilana took position at the center of the circle. In unison, they began chanting the ancient phrases that had once brought the living shadows to life. Their voices wove a trembling harmony in the stale air, causing the torches around the room to flicker with a strange golden hue. Almost immediately, the darkness in every corner started to stir, drawn by the gravitational pull of the reenacted ritual. A low, unearthly hum rattled the basement's foundations. Pieces of rubble fell from the ceiling, and the lines of the summoning circle burned with luminous intensity. Groans and shrieks echoed as each living shadow, wherever it lurked, felt the call. Dozens of twisting shapes slipped in from cracks and corners, sliding down walls and across floors in an effort to reach the circle. The swirl of blackness roiled around the chalk lines, pounding at the invisible barrier formed by the recited incantation. Ilana's voice felt raw in her throat, yet she continued, focusing on the vow of protection. Beads of sweat rolled down her temple, and she could sense her own fears itching to escape as the mass of living shadows hissed. One by one, the shadows latched onto the outer ring of symbols, trying to seep through. The circle glowed in response, fueled by Ilana's unwavering anchor. The entire city seemed to groan with pent-up gloom, funneled into the basement. For a moment, it looked like the circle might crack under the bombardment. The chalk lines flickered, sparks of arcane energy sputtered, and Gavid's tone faltered. "But Trent," Ilana steadied her voice. She poured her compassion into the words, summoning every image of justice, community, and family she could muster. Somehow, that flickering chalk circle held. The swirling darkness gathered into a writhing orb within the boundaries. An otherworldly cacophony resounded as the final silhouettes were pulled out of the night air and into the gravitational swirl. Then, with a burst of blinding radiance, the circle sealed shut. A brilliant shockwave of light erupted through the basement, surging out into the building and beyond, flooding the city streets with clarity. Every shapeless mass of darkness trapped within the symbols disintegrated into threads of inert shadow, dissolving into nothingness. People all across town felt a weight lift from their hearts, as though a dark cloud had passed and bright sun replaced the gloom. Small pockets of the city that had been murky and tense for weeks now felt lighter, cleansed of the insidious force lurking in every corner. Exhausted, Ilana swayed on her feet, barely able to stand. The ritual had taken a toll on her spirit. Dr. Rafik and one of the officers rushed to steady her. Gavid, standing at the edge of the circle, looked relieved in a way that made him seem years younger. The savage mania that had consumed the city slowly loosened its grip. The basement fell silent but for the occasional drip of water leaking from ancient pipes. They stepped out into the night, half expecting to see chaos or find themselves mired in gloom. Instead, they discovered a peaceful hush. The neon signs along the skyline still blinked, but the tension in the air had vanished. Night owls ambled calmly down sidewalks without argument. At the precinct, Ilana's colleagues reported fewer calls for disturbances. Reports of random violence and strange episodes dropped to almost nothing by dawn. It was as if the city had awakened from a dreadful nightmare, with only a faint recollection of the darkness that had nearly swallowed it whole. Gavid, his shoulders sagging, offered himself up for judgment, fully aware that he had instigated the crisis. "I won't run any more," he murmured to Ilana. "Don't let me fall through the cracks again. If you spare me, I shall devote whatever remains of my years to righting the wrongs I helped create." There was sincerity in his words, a willingness to atone that Ilana found genuine. Yet she also understood that the law needed to intervene. If he had evaded it for so long, it must now take its rightful course. In a decision combining mercy with justice, Ilana debriefed her superiors. Gavid would remain under observation and face due process. Searchers of his labyrinthine laboratory turned up more arcane contractions and spells, which the authorities stored away as evidence and for eventual destruction. Recognizing the dangers of letting any living shadow experiment happen again, Dr. Rafiq volunteered to aid in systematically deactivating or securing the materials. Over the next days, the city returned to a semblance of normalcy. In the quieter corners of the precinct, though, Ilana would sometimes catch glimpses of suspicious shapes drifting by a lamppost or across a back alley. Memories of the living shadows remained, and she suspected that while they were banished this time, darkness in one form or another tended to linger where it was least expected. Nevertheless, the immediate threat was contained and the people reclaimed their city. Fragments of recollection, how they'd acted under the shadow's influence, lingered shamefully. Apologies were exchanged across broken friendships. Couples mended relationships. It was a reminder that the human heart, given a push in a malevolent direction, could be its own worst enemy. Yet it also reaffirmed how resilience and unity could drive back the lurking shadows of despair. On her last patrol before dawn one morning, Ilana walked the now familiar path where she had first become suspicious. The alley was quiet. No dark smear stained the concrete. Her phone vibrated with a message. The district attorney had registered Gavid's case. She pocketed the phone and continued, pausing to watch as the rising sun edged over the horizon. Light spilled in an amber cascade across the skyline, chasing away the final traces of night. Breathing in the crisp air, she felt the city's renewed energy. If a new threat should ever emerge from the hidden corners of the world, she hoped they would be prepared. At least for now, the darkness no longer owned the night. Unseen above her, in the receding blackness of a rooftop, a thin wisp of shadow lingered. Trapped? Perhaps momentarily. Yet it watched with an ageless patience only the night comprehended. In time, it dissolved into the brightness. Its essence would remain, lying dormant like a waiting echo, biding its time until the cycle of uncertainty and fear might call it forth once again. But for now, on the streets below, warmth and calm had returned. Ilana tucked her hands into her pockets, letting the promise of daylight guide her home. The machines of the city whirred, the sirens receded, and for a while at least, the shadows were unbound no more.